first is that you've talked about the idea of part of what like helps you stay motivated to work so hard, which, from our interactions that we've had thus far, I notice you're someone who has that dog in them, as the kids would say. Like I notice you really seem to get after it. And you talked about how like people our age in decades or centuries past were, spent weeks or months in trenches, covered
Yeah.
in blood, getting burnt to death and blown to bits and all these sorts of things, and using that frame helps you to continue to work as hard as you do on this in this, revolution. I think is maybe, you want to be delicate about the frame, but I think it's the correct
Right.
frame. Um
Yeah.
what so yeah, so for the people that are newer to this too, like what is Bitcoin revolting against? Like what's wrong with fiat currency? And I mean like specifically from the ethical perspective. It's like, why is Bitcoin ethically superior? Why is it a system that's like better for humanity and like worth fighting for in that way?
Yeah. So Jake, you're a Christian, right? So, I'll be a little more overt here than typical, but I mean, the fundamental truth of the universe is that man is fallen. Mankind is not God. God made us in His own image, and we chose corruption. We chose sin. We chose the uh, knowledge of all good and evil, which is another way of saying sin. And Jesus is the light. Jesus is the Savior. He is the perfect sacrificial lamb, right? He is the ultimate proof of work, right? If you have a corrupted creature, it takes the same way it takes a literal infinite amount of energy to convert mass to have mass go at light speed, right? So it's literally physically impossible, right? You need an infinite amount of energy to reach the speed of light, right? It's an infinite, unachievable proof of work. It's the same thing with mankind being righteous, right? It's that it takes an infinite proof of work for us to undo the stain that is on our hearts, right? And so that's what Jesus is. Jesus is the perfect proof of work, right? To cover the corruption, sin in mankind, you need a perfect sacrifice, right? So that's what Jesus is. And my point in that is that, well, I'm not Jesus. I'm not God, right? You don't even have to be a Christian to admit that you're not God, right? No human being in the history of man, besides Jesus, is morally righteous enough to declare what the world's laws are, right? It's just man is incompetent. Man is not omniscient. Man has a corrupt heart, right? We may do righteous things. We may do good things, but just because someone does, some good works does not mean they're worthy, right? Again, you can go faster, but it takes an infinite amount of going faster to reach the speed of light, right? Or infinite amount of energy, I would just say, to reach the speed of light. So my point in all that is that, the main problem is corruption. The main problem isn't fiat money. The main problem is not even government. The main problem is sin and corruption. And what fiat money does is it gives the power of the equation that is monetary policy to human beings. And so, of course, obviously, if you give mankind the ability to print a fiat button, say, oh, on my decree, let there be light, let's create energy out of nothing in this zero-sum game aspect, which inherently has to take energy from the smallest users of the system and give it to the largest users of the system. That's inherently a zero-sum game. It's
What do you
inherently
mean when you say that? Like how does fiat take from the smallest users of the system and give it to the greatest user of the system? What does that look like practically for people to understand?
Well, so at the time of recording, there's a major forest fire or now in the city going on in LA, right? 5 people tragically died in that event. As a piece of context, though, 340,000 people a year die from forest fires, almost all of them in sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia. My point with that is that, when American property in Los Angeles collapses and 5 people die, we all freak out, as in many cases we probably should, because this event seems to be preventable. But, we tend to forget about people in more poor places of the world, right? And my point there is that if Americans were to zoom out and realize what's actually going on, that's essentially what we're doing with fiat money, right? If America prints 5% more political currency units and exports those 5% political currency units to the rest of the world, onto the rest of the world, that means that we've effectively stolen some percentage, some sub 5% percentage, or maybe even not, because the assets appreciate faster than 5%. We have taken money from the developing world and imported it to the developed world without actually having to move raw materials. So, it's basically plundering without actually having to use force to take physical resources, just forced with standardizing, right? I mean, it's the same reason why meme coins are a scam, right? If I make a token out of thin air, I hold the majority of supply, I hold the control to create more supply, and I distribute that token to 100,000 people that are all holding it, saving in it. If I just print more tokens, I am printing myself into a larger percentage of the total supply. And so therefore I am printing myself into taking money from other people via a backhand, system, right? I'm not stealing people's political currency units, but I'm stealing the percentage of the network those political currency units represent. And so effectively the same thing. So inherently, fiat monetary system has to be a zero-sum game. It has to inherently steal from the poor to the rich, right? You can't have the poor steal from the rich, right? Not even that's ethical, but you can't even have it the opposite way. It has to be stealing from the poor to the rich, because the rich ones, the wealthy ones, are in charge of maintaining that currency system. That's how that system works. It's proof of stake. It's based upon who's the most powerful elite member. And there is a very real human cost associated with that. And the reason Bitcoin's important is because Bitcoin is a monetary system without that possibility for human distortion and control, right? Yes, humans made Bitcoin, but humans cannot manipulate that currency supply down or in particular up, right? So it's not only possible, it's inevitable. People will use Bitcoin for evil things. It's just a tool, right? People can use any tool for evil things, but the system itself does not have a built-in back-end button towards systemic corruption and systemic institutionalized monetary incentive to propagate sin, because that's essentially what fiat money does, right? There's a very clear reason why alcoholism, divorce rates, the purchases of lottery tickets, porn, drugs. There is a very startling realization most people have when they realize all those things and many, many more. Childlessness, right? The desire to not have kids. All those things, not just the cost of education and housing and food and energy, right? Not just that, but all those things I just mentioned, all of them have been rising dramatically, consistently since the 1970s. And there's many factors for that, but I think one of the largest factors, if not the initial factor for that, is that we created the highest monetizable technology on the entire planet, which is money. We have turned that into a system to accelerate incentives towards destruction and sin. And I think anyone that's not a Christian can still admit to themselves that they aren't God, right? At least if they're intellectually consistent. They should be able to admit to themselves that, and they should be able to admit, not even I am worthy to be in charge of the world's money. And for those that are Christians, I think the burden is even higher, because, God calls us to love our neighbors, and the most loving thing we can do for our neighbors is put them in an environment that does not have sin economically incentivized for them to do. There will still be sin, still be corruption. The world will still have its problems, and they, will still, need a savior. But I would rather see more people in a world where sin is not the most profitable business in the world. It probably always will be to some degree, but that is the heart of the difference. The real problem is not the government, and the real problem is not your opposing political party color of choice. The problem is human corruption. If we didn't have human corruption, we wouldn't need to have this conversation. If we could trust human beings, we wouldn't need to worry about the Fed. We wouldn't need to worry about politicians, because they would do everything right, everything moral. But the problem is you can't trust people, and so you need a currency system that doesn't require that trust. And so I think the burden on Christians is very high, that, if If you have faith in things not of this world, it's a pretty easy ask to ask you to sacrifice things of this world to work towards a paradigm that hopefully incentivizes people to have a longer term mindset. Um,
Mhm.
you know,
One of my like favorite metaphors or in this relating to this, I guess, is that I kind of walk people down this path using a Lord of the Rings analogy, essentially. But we've all heard the idea that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it seems to me that the best proxy for power that humans have access to is money. And so when you give somebody limitless access to unearned power, not that they've traded for, not that they've had some consensual value add relationship with, you give them limitless corruption. And then I you could say that what Satoshi gave us is the opportunity, if we so choose as a human collective, to take that one ring of power that is the money printer, to take that, that
yeah,
that corrupting force that people use to, subjugate others rather than to engage in play, engage in consensual relationships, that we have the opportunity to cast it into the fires of Mordor by adopting Bitcoin, or maybe we don't like we often talk in the Bitcoin space about like Bitcoin being inevitable, sort of, and I do lean towards this way of thinking, but nothing is guaranteed, nothing is inevitable, truly,
right,
like in some ways I think looking back we'll be like, oh, of course it was inevitable, but it doesn't have to be. And there are real world scenarios that play out where humanity misses it, I think, where the adoption doesn't come to pass. I mean, I find it unlikely, but of course you have to consider the possibility. And there's that world. There were the dark ages in whatever, the first century into the second century, or yeah, the first millennia.
yeah,
And who's to say that we couldn't have a digital dark ages, so to speak, where maybe we miss it, and maybe you see like the sort of the sort of technology that allows for the sort of control that guys like Orwell and Solzhenitsyn and Aldous Huxley that they warned us about, like, or things like the technology that allows for control that's much greater than what they could have ever anticipated, and we could, if we're not oriented properly, we could miss it, and so that's part of, there's that sense of
yeah.
urgency that comes with that.